All right. Cool. Just a couple of housekeeping before we begin then. First, obviously, please be sensitive of whatever you're trying to talk about. Don't make generalizations. Check out the frills of your words. Secondly, before you begin your speech, give us a countdown of 3, 2, 1. So that everyone is ready, then have quickly set. But I'll also just urge you to keep your own time so that at least we have a backup timer running in case finally one falls. You can also just specify your POI preference before you begin your speech in order to just reinforce amongst everyone. I've just also urged speakers to handle it. Lastly, speech time 7:15. We won't be noting down anything that is spoken beyond that. If you just obviously exceed time, I'll just indicate with my hands raising up and I'll authenticate the chat to your hands. Cool. With all of this out of the way, I am happy to call the Prime Minister to open the case stand committee. Yeah.
Hey, just give me a second. I'm getting my timer. I'll be trying to open my video just so that it feels more humane. But again, I might chop you and I will open up my video.
No, I think you're yeah.
Okay, great, awesome. I'll take POI verbally. So please make sure to not use the chat and unmute yourself. And yeah, speech starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 pieces of framing from side opening government. The first, what is my net interest? A, we want to show action and takes a massive amount of control globally, showing that we're governments that can do and solve a lot of problems inside the world. The second is that there's a massive oil reserve and oil crisis in the current status quo. I think this mainly happens because the sanction that happens around Russia and the issues that happens around Ukraine. This means that oil prices squeeze up, and this is extremely important due to the fact that oil affects a lot of the prices of the goods that runs to our society. Knowing the fact that a lot of the goods uses oil in its producing, but also uses it for its movability, supply chains, and etc. Thirdly, I think there's also an attempt to diversify as an intuition pump our oil reserve, but through expansion to Alaska Antarctica, but that's never lead to nothing. I think this will be fulfilled when we often lift the sanction to Venezuela. Secondly, let's talk about Venezuela, their oils, and their stance right now. I think regardless on both sides, Venezuelan government has massive amount of leverage to open trade with other countries, rendering our sanction to be extremely useless in current status quo. There are 3 reasons why this is the case. The first is the competitive advantage to trade oil due to Ukraine and Russian sanctions. So most likely other countries such as China, for example, and other types of countries that doesn't really comply with US sanction would most likely also seek out deals with Venezuelan government. The second is that geographically, their placement of Venezuela offer a pretty well off spot for supply chain and movability of oil. The third is because they're cheap, because currency value is extremely low. Nations don't really care about human rights violations, etc., so long as they are benefited by the trade that is created by this that's created by this country. Just look at the fact of how many countries creates deals with China, even though there are massive human rights violations through the Uyghur and etc. Right? So what this means is that on both sides, Venezuelan government will still raise a massive amount of capacity to do trade and massive amount of capital to maintain their governments. It is unlikely that Maduro will be toppled down and own OGB, prepared to have the first mover advantage and allow control to the Venezuelan government, knowing the fact that it's inevitable that we have some level of capital. What does lifting sanction look like on site opening government? A, this is allowing trade. B, this is allowing limited and monitor access to bank account that they have, the capital reserve that they have. C, this also, there's a massive amount of control that US can have. For example, when they lift the sanction, obviously we won't let Maduro run wild. For example, there will be some level of monitoring and control towards human rights when we lift sanction. Note that this is a two-way street where we can also demand something from the government and we can control them to a certain extent. Lastly, I want to note that the United States has done this multiple times. As an intuition palm, we allow Taliban to reign in on, Taliban to reign in and doesn't really do a lot about it. Because we know there could be some level of control that can be done when we cooperate with governments that are bad. 3 arguments. The first, I'm going to talk about the comparative on-site position. The second, I'm going to talk about oil reserves in US. And the third, I'm going to talk about Venezuelan citizen, which I would argue one of the most vulnerable individual in this debate. The first argument is going to talk about comparative on off. We have proven to you that even regardless of the sanction, Venezuela and Maduro governments will still receive trade deals from other countries and massive amount of capital. Why is this bad when it's not done on our term? The first, that you empower an institution that has the massive amount of human rights violation and corruption, etc. It gives them capital, trade to do trade, for example, and that's a connection with other. So it's more unlikely for the government to be toppled down. The second, that you have the ability to work authoritarian governments, i.e. hegemony that exists in and would move constantly work with Venezuela, regardless of their governance. The third is that global control over oil, i.e., being supply chain provider for oil, ensure that there's massive amount of global control that Venezuelan government can have that weakens our sanction, but also complicate future relationship. The conclusion is, if you let Venezuela rampant and doesn't do amount of control and lift sanction and leave them alone, Venezuelan can have massive amount of power and capital to do atrocious thing and maintain their government. Why is our side comparatively better? Two reasons. The first is that you enable and block off authoritarian governments, i.e. creating deals that are exclusive to our own, blocking countries such as China and other governments that are bad and significantly more authoritarian. The second is that control and towards the government and its execution, slowly ensuring that Bolsonaro can control on our side comparatively the Venezuelan government and the capital that we have. The second argument that we're going to talk about oil reserve in the United States. The thesis for this argument is that oil reserve and price are increasing heavily due to lack of supply, especially with the Russian war. This led to prices increase. Why is this so important? The first is that for Biden, this affects key swing voter the most. These are the white working men who rights trucks and are mostly work in the industry that uses oil most of the time. This affects the wages, the amount of capital that they get and such. The second is that economic development is significantly reduced because there's massive recession inflation, i.e. increased price for goods because of travel prices and increased oil prices. The third is that the enable expansion, for example, so high prices on oil disable our capacity to open up more plants, for example, fuel resources, especially and rock. We need to do this to continue industrial expansion, which will drive the economy forward. I would note that it's extremely important for Biden to maintain economic cheaper because we have key exclusive deal with Venezuela, trade-off in currency is lower and you have cheaper oil. So the second is that you have massive amount of control of their capital. This means that you can also advise for their capital reserve, for example, to push the use of their budget for plant and drilling creation for plantation, meaning increased supply of oil, which would reduce the price and accessibility as well. The third is the better trade for the alternative so that we have more options in the future. Before I move on to the third arguments, talking about the most vulnerable individual in the Venezuelan society, I'll take closing.
Look, the burden you have in this debate, not to say why you should lift some sanctions, but to have all sanctions lifted. You can on upside still lift sanctions on oil, but not on the rest.
Nope, I'm telling you that lifting sanctions can also mean we can have some level of monitor. This means that they can have access to their capital, they can do trades, but under our monitoring. I don't get why this is something that's entirely bad. Let's talk about Venezuelan citizens. I would argue that are heaviest and the most and hits heaviest for the most vulnerable identity, which is the Venezuelan citizen. This looks like you not be having food. This looks like you not having access to capital and banks, for example. This looks like you not having the capacity to rise up because you're too busy feeding yourself and the lack of a movement to topple the government in of itself. On our side, we provide some level of leverage to the people to at least survive on a day-to-day basis, access to food, access to economical development that are slow, access to at least free distribution that will keep them alive another day, which would benefit them to a certain, which would benefit them in the future, not only for their survivability, their capacity to do massive amount of toppling towards the current governments that we have. So the prerequisite of ensuring that the government actually change is ensuring that the people survive on the ground and they're able to actually actively criticize and actually come up with opposition on our side. This can only be done when we lift our sanction and they don't have any alternative to survive other than, i.e. moving away from the country. Like, this is the only option that they have. Proud to propose.
I thank the PM and invite the leader of OP so that you were just like choppy in between, but it was just like for a few seconds, so and we were able to grasp whatever you were trying to say. Hello, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, it did freeze a lot for me. So I think Oyuka will become part of it as well. But okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Our stance is very simple, particularly for a motion that is so radical and where opening government refuses to engage. Some sanctions are extremely necessary. We think that we simply oppose upliftment of all sanctions. We can support more diplomatic approaches, such as it happened with Cuba under Obama. We think that there can be more monitoring the moment that you open up in certain areas, but not in all of them. there are three characterizations from the status quo that we support. The first one is that the upliftment has been quite targeted. That is, it has been like some things have been uplifted regarding like the oil industry, but it hasn't even been like the entire industry. I think it mostly happens like in like areas that can help like cover debt, for example. So the reason why they uplifted sanctions so that Chevron could mine or like get oil was to cover for Chevron's debt. Like I think in general it has been quite particular. The second thing to note is it has been well paced. That is, Biden is not like rushing it himself, right? I think that overall it's been a very like meticulous process of noting when it is politically salient to do this. So for example, he did it once the war in Ukraine was pretty like present, so and therefore like it might have been useful to like have more engagement with a power that has a lot of petroleum once Russia is out of the game. The third thing to note is the US just has the upper hand, and I think like, well, whatever actor is not Venezuela for a couple of reasons. The first one is, in most instances, Maduro just doesn't have legitimacy, not in Venezuela, not outside of Venezuela. And what that therefore means is anytime he can claim that others are opening up for him, like he will take it. And I think that therefore it is perfectly possible for you to just open up in certain circumstances and just uplift in certain ways. Which policies definitely do stay, which sanctions? Well, it is the ones that are on the 150 like elite members. These are bankers, oil men, people who just have control and have been oppressing the average Venezuelan for years. Two arguments. First, I want to talk about abuse and legitimization. First and foremost, and I think this already wins us the round, is that Maduro and the regime that is in place is extremely dangerous, extremely violent, and it's one that you ought not like legitimize through removing the sanctions. The first thing to note is this regime has been historically extremely dangerous. In 2017, there were more than 150 people murdered through the protests that were supporting Guaidó. In most instances, freedom of expression has been extremely limited. Channels are controlled by a particular like group controlled by Maduro. There are significant numbers of political prisoners, and in general, significant elections have been rigged. Ladies and gentlemen, when 1/4 of the population of Venezuela has left, I just don't think that the message you should send to those populations is that like it is completely fine because it is now convenient for the US to do this. The reason for this is twofold. Number one, because we just think the US has a principled responsibility to the world, or like all countries generally do. And I think that this allows for Maduro to continue to perpetuate the three things that I just talked about in the moment in which we can say, look, even our biggest enemies, who are the Yankees, the imperialists, the capitalists, are noticing that I am not that bad. And secondly, I think that in most instances, what this means is that you have worse off relationships and cohesion with the people that have migrated outside of Venezuela. Closing.
If the US cared so much about democracy or anything like that, why haven't they put in similar sanctions to other countries? I don't know, like Saudi Arabia.
I don't think the US is super cool, but I think that in many instances, it is important for the US to do these things. If your claim is that they should do it in other circumstances, then I think that is probably knifing your opening and any potential case you bring. Like that point just says, like, I agree with you, they should also sanction other bad countries, sure. The second thing to note is this creates a loss in discourse and legitimacy. There are three contradictions in removing these sanctions. The first is it is very contradictory within Democrats. I think that in passing policy within the US and in having future sanctions, I think it is less likely for you to be convincing, particularly when the Biden administration is happening during completely like tense geopolitical times. I think it is more likely for you to be able to engage in conflicts like Russia, in like other issues that are ongoing in Latin America, to the degree where you can actually help, where you are going against literal like dictators such as Maduro, where I do think that it is convenient for them to intervene. I think so it is within Democrats, since like these policies were not just put by Trump, they started since 2006. Obama upheld many of them. The second thing to note is this is very contradictory to overall foreign policy, particularly because it is contradictory in terms of the stance that you have with Juan Guaidó. In general, Juan Guaidó was low-key a puppet of the US, but but the US, in terms of foreign policy, still calls Juan Guaidó as like the legitimate president of Venezuela. The issue when you like leave this person behind is that opposition in Venezuela is extremely like vulnerable now, because they know that abroad, because whatever the US does is whatever most Western liberal democracies will do, they will have no support in the future. Because no matter how hard they try, as long as it is economically convenient for the US to remove certain sanctions in another country, they have no incentive to resorting to them. So that means that the opposition in Venezuela in the future completely depends on itself. That just means that people on the ground in Venezuela have lesser alternatives. In a country where elections are already rigged, this is crucially this is very determining for their lives. The third thing to note is it is unlikely that Venezuela immediately just joins all markets. I think there are two things that can potentially happen. Either Venezuela just continues to be pretty closed, because note that to a certain extent they are the ones who have followed this the isolation that they have been put into and continued it. But second, in the best case scenario, I just think that Maduro is likely to open up. But they had to, an opening government, tell you why this was good to begin with for Venezuelans. Because if you remember, the reason why Venezuela started going to shit was because they overly depended on international markets, because the price of oil went drastically down, because 90% of their oil was being exported. In most instances, the best case scenario of opening government and the potential case for closing government is still one where the US will enter these countries and get the oil that was historically belonging to Venezuelan people. The only possible response to this is that they are not getting much access anyways, and that you at least create jobs. But I don't think this is the case when in most instances it is US companies exporting workers, exporting companies to mine in Venezuela. I think it is substantially worse than the already bad status quo. The last thing to note is I just think this is worse for sovereignty of the Venezuelan people, because for one, cross-apply all the analysis that I gave on why Maduro gains legitimacy through this. But secondly, I think that some subsets of Venezuelan society are being controlled because of the sanctions. So the more than 150 members of the elite that I talked about at the top are people who can literally continue to privatize particular areas abroad. There are people who corrupt officials who can just reopen their access to properties abroad, whose accounts and their trade in bonds were being frozen. These are people who have actively harmed the Venezuelan population. I think the US and the world genuinely loses legitimacy when we backtrack on the sanctions to one of the worst leaders of the 21st century. Very proud to oppose.
I thank Alon and have called in here.
Okay, checking. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, I'll take POI through chat. I'll offer it probably around 5 as well. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I think the first issue I got to reestablish is why this will be very effective in getting oil resources for the US. One, the urgency and the problem in status quo. We already talked about how Russia as an oil source has been very limited, increasing tensions, their agenda being focused on Ukraine, spending that oil on that invasion means that we're not able to get oil from them. Second of all, other sources such as China, our tension, US and China tensions are rising. We're getting nowhere, and China itself has been facing recent bouts of the newer strains of COVID, making it so they need to hoard their own resources. Domestically in the US, the oil sources are also getting limited. Alaska is getting drained, and we have not been able to get anything going in Antarctica to be able to provide for our people. This is proven by in the status quo. There is a huge problem in the status quo of oil prices rising exponentially, especially in the US. So this is important because unfortunately outside of New York, there's very minimal effective public transport, and this effectively makes the transportation of everyday people less economically salient. Overall, the economic activity is lower in quantity. By lifting our sanctions, it's showing that we are going to be a big favor towards Venezuela, and this is a great overall way to position ourselves in the future. The framing that was very important from my prime minister is that Venezuela in the future will become more valuable because they are trying to get more international reputation, specifically through their oil resources, because it's still valuable. It was a huge drop definitely during COVID, but as the pandemic is getting lower and transportation is getting higher, it is becoming more valuable, which means in the future countries will still want to buy from them despite the political turmoil that Oo pointed out, because still it is very cheap. Venezuela has a lot of untapped big oil supply, so that's why the prices are lower. It's a lot of crude oil as well, so it's accessible and cheap for most nations. And the reason why they don't care about the politics is China as an example. This means that the sanction that we're still imposing is not strategic at this point because we're going to be losing position over control in Venezuela. This is important because to kickstart the economy of the US facing the current recession that's still recovering from post-COVID and the increasing lack of global oil, we need to do this. And second of all, outside of facing this recession, the opportunity cost of not getting the first mover's advantage is one that Biden does not want to lose out on. Second of all, our responsibility as Biden itself. other than just what is good for Venezuela, we're also going to engage how Biden owes this to his constituents, because he needs to be able to make policy changes that are not simply huge compromises for everything that he promised in the past. The lifting of student loan has been less than 1%, very minuscule. Police reform hasn't really happened. They haven't really become more green or eco-friendly. They haven't really added more taxes for the rich. One of the biggest reasons why this hasn't happened is because the idea about how socialist or communist nations and policies are always going to be bad. Look at Cuba, look at Venezuela. This is the argument that's used by Republicans and alt-right voices that reaches the gray area community, they use this as a scapegoat and show that the socialist or communist nations are not at all effective, and this dissuades people from supporting whenever Biden wants to enact more socialist policies like taxing the rich, loan forgiveness, etc. The process is then what we give is lifting all of the sanctions. Now, to try and engage with the question from CO, or also pointed out by OO, why do we not just have the minimal sanction lift or do it step by step? If you do that, then you're going to be very half-baked in allowing Venezuela to prosper. Because with Venezuela lifting all of their sanctions, they're going to have a lot more prosperity. They're going to be able to develop and sell and extract more of their oil that they will get from lifting these sanctions. Their governments can access funds from the US to do better government programs such as education or infrastructure building. If OO says reliance on oil was very bad, we understand that. But what is the alternative on opposition then? If you have if you maintain a lot of sanctions, then you have to admittedly limit the ability to diversify the economy and the development of Venezuela. This is then very important for Biden as well, because they are the closest thing to a good case study to push more socialist policies that Biden's party, the Democrats, care about. People will easily buy the right-wing propaganda and fear-mongering of socialism if the top socialist nations in the world cannot even survive. So it has to be a full-fledged move. The Maduro administration is socialist and in line with Biden's party's ideas, especially the biggest members of them, including Bernie, including AOC, and they want to consolidate and maintain the support. And even if there is some level of instability or problems, it happens regardless of the leader that is chosen in Venezuela. Political education and stability is always going to be questionable, so them hinging their case on Maduro being very, very bad is not going to be good, because their alternative is not better either. But then, engaging in their principle, they talked about how the US has a responsibility to be supporting politically good nations. We say that this is invalid and this was a thing of the past. The reason why is because as far as the US goes, for the last several years, and even during Biden's presidency, they haven't really cut ties with leaders from other nations that are also authoritarian or also doing things like killing protesters. They have connections still with Brazil and Bolsonaro for the past several years. They have a clear support for a country like Israel, despite them actively invading Palestine and killing people there. So this shows to you that there is no principal responsibility they have to only support very, very good nations. ECG also already pointed out that is to the Middle East, but again, that means that our counterproposal isn't to say everyone should be sanctioned. We say that if opposition wants to impose that principal burden, they're the one backstabbing the status quo, where clearly the US doesn't care about that principle anymore. Alternatively, what we say is that the US in the status quo is trying to gain and maintain hegemony through being economically supportive and being the economic leader of the world, instead of allowing China to become the top dog and allowing their practices to become the popular one. We want to show and position ourselves as the most dominant one, rather than allow other nations to surpass us in this regard. Before I move on to the other comparisons, I'll take a point from CO.
Okay, so why would people follow Biden with more socialist policies right after lifting sanctions on one of the most self-proclaimed socialist states? Because he's not going to get public support for that.
The reason why he's not getting, this is the process that we mentioned. The reason why he's not getting public support is because there's not been any good case studies of being socialist, being a socialist nation and it running effectively. So we can show by Cuba being very, very poor, by being communist, and Venezuela in their current leaders failing to progress, not because of their socialist ideology, but because the US has been has given them a lot of sanctions in the past. So this correlation and showing that the US is willing to support another socialist nation so that Biden and his party are able to show that these policies are actually effective and possible in lifting up and supporting the people on the ground. This is the prerequisite in order to show that these policies are at all valuable. On opposition, these policies that are Biden's responsibility and the lives of the Venezuelans themselves will be traded off because they're not able to show any sort of progress in this nation, the one that is closest to us. Outside of this, OG has also already given you all of the economic benefits that are separate from all of the principal responsibilities of being very democratic or being very fair to the people. This is very important also to save the Venezuelan economy, and directly by helping the US by giving them more oil, and for all those reasons, proud to propose.
I thank KPM and Yellow.
Let me set up my timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Although they talk a little bit about helping the people, we tell you that political salience and the ability to accountably distribute finances of the Venezuelan government is a precondition to any financial gain towards the citizens. Note how they crucially don't explain like how the economy is going to develop for the average citizen, other than saying that oil is going to be sold and the economy is going to develop. There's no connection there, and we tell you that the people at the regime, the people at the top who are like in charge of the oligarchs and everything, will reap the benefits of these finances and further finance their ambitions, and this will not trickle down to the bottom. Secondly, we tell you that like on their point, basically their point about like getting more power is about how economic trade pressure is going to limit them from doing other things and limit them from doing things like turning to China. Two responses. Firstly, China has little interest to deal with Venezuela's failed economy. They never proved otherwise. They never explained China's incentives. But secondly, they have their own oil reserves. And thirdly, lifting sanctions with no like concession gives Venezuela the freedom to engage with other countries like Russia and whatever bad actor they want to without any economic harm, because you've lifted all the sanctions and now their oil industry is booming and they have like no retaliation and they can like side with whoever they want to, right? Secondly, we tell you that political pressure is going to be stronger. What does this mean? Whatever like persuasion mechanism they want to say by saying that the like economic trade gives them more power over Venezuela comes along on our side with political pressure, so long as you can say that we're going to slowly start opening up your oil industry to the US, so long as you concede as the Venezuelan government and as Maduro's regime. That's the only way you actually get productive concessions that help the industry and the actual people of Venezuela in order to make sure that the benefits trickle down. Compare this to the massive assumptions on their side that they can somehow moderate and monitor Maduro, even though there's literally like no like ties attached to removing sanctions, right? Secondly, on political alignment, they keep talking about how they want to legitimize themselves and become the superpower, and also legitimize how Biden's socialist. Biden is barely socially democratic. To go as far as to say that they are partners with similar beliefs with Maduro's regime is insane. And therefore, we believe that since it does not align with like the Biden supporters' beliefs, no one looks at the Venezuelan government, especially with the news of the status quo, and is going to be happy about like their president supporting whatever the regime is doing, and therefore Biden is going to lose a lot of legitimacy in like domestically, right? Secondly, this argument just proves that whenever Biden does something this massive towards a horrible dictator, they have to prove why it's legitimate. They have to defend their actions. This means that they necessarily have to defend Maduro's actions and say that the relationship with Venezuela is worth it, which is actively bad because it removes like the legitimacy of the US stance because they're principally inconsistent, right? Moving on, then, we tell you that when they talk about political dominance, that on their side is not achieved. Why is that the case? Because firstly, you send a very clear message by delegitimizing your past opinions and like past declarations and sanctions. What does that mean? When you've been sanctioning a country since 2006 for 16 years, when your own party was a part of like the sanctions that were in place, you not only contradict your government, your party, and like all that your supporters believe, you contradict what you wanted to achieve in the future, and you necessarily say that you failed in this act, and now you're losing and you're conceding to a dictator, right? Secondly, what this means is that your population is also going to like see you as delegitimized, and they don't like trust you anymore, and therefore your political dominance globally and also internally massively decreases, whether you want to like run as for presidency again, like, or whether you want your party to be more popular, does not succeed. And furthermore, the US globally loses a lot of legitimacy. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from closing.
This motion is not an actor motion. Why do we care if Biden or the party is benefited when people in Venezuela are starving?
We tell you that on our side, we benefit the people of Venezuela because your side permanently pockets the like wealth and pockets like permanently benefits the pockets of the rich. The oil reserves are going to be in the stronghold of the Venezuelan regime, and the likelihood of Venezuela's regime and oligarchs seizing the oil reserves and keeping like the wealth to themselves is high. When that happens, the likelihood and ability for the US to re-put sanctions is low, because now you're double delegitimizing yourself, and the government's likelihood of like doing that is low, and therefore you put these citizens in further financial strife, and therefore it's worse. But secondly, we tell you that we're not talking necessarily like in terms of talking about Biden, what his supporters think is important, but it's not just about that, right? It's about what like the government itself thinks, and furthermore, it's about what the government is seen as. And also, if you think that like America's like what happens in America domestically doesn't matter, that's like contradictory to your opening. Moving on, we tell you that on our side of the house, you align yourself to people who are principally contradictory to yourself. And furthermore, we tell you that all you're doing on your side is helping the government, the regime, and entrenching their power, their stance in the government, and making them making sure that they're there forever. We tell you that this is a prerequisite for any economic gain that government teams want to achieve. We tell you that this is weighed above these arguments. And secondly, we tell you that there are different ways to get the oil benefits by slowly decreasing sanctions. Very, very proud to oppose.
We invite Mo here.
Sorry, my computer is being really funny. I hope this will work out. Am I audible so far?
Yep, all good.
Perfect. Please put your POIs in the chat, and I will try and take one at around like 5:30. Yes. All right. I will start in I'll start in 3, 2, 1 now. Okay, the case that closing opposition is going to bring it into this debate, clashing with both opening and closing government, is that one, Venezuelans' problems, both economic and political, existed prior to the American sanctions. So lifting these sanctions like will not just magically fix the structural problems that Venezuela has. Two, how the sanctions have had good impacts and should continue to do so. For example, and we're going to explain to you how, one, this has limited the Venezuelan regime's ability to abuse their population, and two, how this is used and will continue to be used as leverage in negotiations between Venezuela and the US to then actually, promote the structural and economic reforms needed for Venezuela to actually become a prosperous country. Now, first to the Venezuela's problems before and during the sanctions, right? Look, what everybody knows, they had huge economic mismanagement and corruption, right? They had hyperinflation, shortages of basic goods such as food and medicine before the sanctions. There were widespread allegations of corruption within the government, which has, then continued to exacerbate the problems of like the country's economic problems. Am I still audible? Because my computer froze, whatever. The political instability and persecution, right? Like Venezuela had experienced significant political turmoil in recent years, with protests and unrest breaking out over issues like electoral fraud, human rights abuse, and the government's handling of the economy. This led to a humanitarian crisis. It was the combination of economic and political mismanagement and instability that had led to that economic crisis, where many people then struggled to access these basic necessities like food, clean water, etc. And there were lots of human rights abuses and
Okay, we lost them. Can someone from the O kindly contact them? Is the other speaker from closing up here?
From closing up?
From closing off.
Oh, yes, I'm here. I'm texting him right now.
Yeah, please. Thanks.
I think what he's trying to do is leave the meeting and come back.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm back. Where did I what should I do?
Okay, so I stopped the timer at 1:55, and the last point that you were trying to talk about is about like electoral fraud and leads to economic crisis and
Yes. Okay, thank you. Then I will continue in 3, 2, 1. Yeah, there were widespread allegations of electoral fraud and human rights abuses, etc., and that is what led to the mass migration of Venezuelans out of Venezuela in the first place. And that is why then the United States started to begin to act, because as the government team has rightly pointed out, yes, the US doesn't everywhere where there's human rights abuses like sanction everybody. But the thing is because it's on the continent of America, issues there concern them a lot, which is why when there's mass migration, which is something that the US is super afraid of because they don't want a lot of immigrants to come there, because that is both dangerous or troublesome politically for them and economically. That is why they then start doing sanctions. And that is why the sanctions that they do point are very targeted and very specific in what they do. And what they try and do is not to hurt the population further, because that then would continue this mass exodus out of Venezuela and exacerbate the migrant crisis. What they try and do is, okay, we want to make sure that these people can stay in their country and not come to our country or other countries. And therefore, what they try and do is to have the sanctions hit not the general population, make them poorer. No, what made them poor is the mismanagement of the Venezuelan regime. No, what they try and do, what the United States tries to do with the sanctions is to target the government to make sure that the regime cannot abuse its people as easily and as effectively as they do now, and then induce structural reform. The burden the closing opposition takes here is not that we're trying to pretend that these sanctions are intended to have mass upheaval and regime change. We don't think that this is the case anymore, right? Because one, it has failed, and two, that's if that were the case, why would Joe Biden start lifting sanctions? No, the goal and the burden that closing opposition is taking in this debate is to say the sanctions are there to mitigate the negative effect of a brutal dictatorship in this country, and that is what we're proving to you on closing opposition. Now, how do the sanctions limit the ability of the Venezuelan regime to abuse their population? And abuse their population. So when closing government tells us, oh, the autonomy and sovereignty is robbed from the poor Venezuelans, what we're telling you is the actors that have removed sovereignty and autonomy from Venezuelan people is the Venezuelan regime. And when the United States tries to come in there and therefore sanctions the regime, we think that that is legitimate and does not remove further autonomy or sovereignty towards the Venezuelans themselves. No, what we say, it actually gives back more autonomy to the individual Venezuelan at the end of the day. Because how do the sanctions limit the ability of the Venezuelan regime to abuse their population? One, they can't access the financial markets. That means they have trouble and difficulty funding the abusive practices like their police force, their military to suppress people and shoot protesters, etc. They are sanctioned from purchasing weapons on the weapons market. That means that they don't have tasers or high surveillance equipment to keep tabs on a population that is unhappy with them. It also means that the ability for the regime to try and negotiate, for example, get political dissidents from other countries back to them is also hindered. Why? Because countries that would then work with the Venezuelan regime would then also be sanctioned by the United States. So all in all, the sanctions are there to and actively do mitigate the harm that the Venezuelan regime, if left unchecked, would do. And what we're telling you is that mitigating the harm to these Venezuelans, which these sanctions actually end up doing, that is the positive impact in this debate, and that is why not all sanctions should be lifted. Note that opening government can maybe talk about, oh, and what we should lift sanctions on oil, and that is good for the US. I don't think how this is relevant. I don't see how this is mutually exclusive with the opposition side, where we can tell you, okay, fine, lift the sanctions on oil, as long as you still keep sanctions on the personal leaders themselves intact, in the sense that, oh, they can't travel to other countries, their bank accounts remain frozen, they can't access luxury goods, which are generally already not accessible to other parts of the population. So as long as you keep those in check, put pressure on there, we think that these sanctions should remain intact and are remaining intact. At this point, closing government. Or not. Okay. Now, the second part was how these sanctions are then used in negotiations. Because obviously the idea was, okay, we are putting these sanctions in place because the structural and political problems exist and are forcing the population outside of this country towards us, and we don't want them here. So maybe whether they're actually doing this for the most moral reason or out of self-interest is irrelevant at the point where this creates positive utility. And what we're telling you is, in these negotiations, the interest of the United States and what they're trying to do is make sure that this is a stable country with an economy that works for enough people so that they don't leave their country, because the prime goal is for the United States to have them not leave their country. So what we're telling you is that in these negotiations, these sanctions are there as leverage to force structural reform in order to protect the population, in order to make sure that this is a somehow inhabitable state, if you're not 100% online with Maduro, and that these sanctions do exactly that. These sanctions can offer a reward when they enact structural reforms, and the sanctions act as punishment and hurt the regime when they do the opposite of complying with a request for reform. For all these reasons, closing opposition.
Thank MO, and I invite the author.
Hello, am I audible?
We can hear you.
Great. So, 3, 2, 1. Panel, notice that opposition has completely ignored the framing that we gave on the reasons and the incentives the US government has. If the US cares about affairs, let's assume what CEO said is true. Let's assume that the US government cares deeply about the affairs in the American continent and the American continent only. Why were there banana republics in Central America? Why was the Pinochet regime established in Chile? They cannot They cannot go behind the little finger and say, oh, American imperialism doesn't exist. America will not push for imperialism in Venezuela. And basically they pretend like democracy will be established by those sanctions. If that was true, it would have happened in these 16 years. It hasn't happened. What did George told you? He told you three things. The first thing is he gave you a bit of framing. Basically, he said why the incentives that the US has for these sanctions in the first place are in order to perpetuate US capitalism and the US empire. Basically, having a scapegoat, Venezuela, and proving that socialism doesn't work by imposing those sanctions. Notice that it has been rather effective because every single fucking Republican says, oh no, we cannot do public healthcare because Venezuela. Notice Democrats also like that stuff because they don't really like public healthcare in the first place, right? So this framing has not been taken down, and we gave you multiple reasons why this framing stands. But on the second level, and what George told you, is that people suffer from these sanctions deeply, and if you remove them, you can at least jumpstart the Venezuelan economy. He told you 4 reasons why that happens, because those sanctions need to affect everyone in order for at least something to happen. But notice, even if they don't affect anyone, George told you that even if you affect the top 150, these sanctions need to be so hard on the top 150 that top 150 is not able to invest, open factories, businesses in order to jumpstart the economy. This is significant, this debate, because it basically means that you have less people being able to afford food. It means that they still roam around in giant barrels of cash in order to buy a single loaf of bread. Panel, notice that they cannot lie behind the democracy thing, because democracy doesn't freaking matter when you don't have food on the table. The bottom line is that if we prove to you that basically there is at least a bit more bread on the table for the average Venezuelan, we win. Let's do some weighing with the OG. So OG said basically that, oh, you jumpstart the economy because oil. Our entire case was not reliant on this. Our case was reliant on having structural reasons of investment between US, Venezuela, but also the competition between China, US, and Venezuela. Because China now knows they cannot bully Venezuela around and buy as much oil as they want for the cheapest price possible. They have to compete with the West, meaning that at least Venezuela benefits from this. But also, we bought into the framing, at least from opening opposition, and we told you why even if the elites are only suffering from it, we still have a fucked up economy that will still suffer. Therefore, we gave this analytical extension for this point to stand. But also notice that this is a certainty. We don't even really have to prove why things will get massively better. If we just prove to you that, which is way more certain, that you have 2 loaves of bread than 1, we still win over opening, because we don't really have to prove anything about the global market changing with oil, and therefore some working class in Michigan has more money on the table. That's still somewhat important, way less important than starving babies in Venezuela. Ultimately, that means we beat over opening government, both because we have a more certain impact, but also because that impact is way larger in magnitude. Now, moving on to opening opposition. What did opening opposition say? Oh, these sanctions are just going to affect the top 150, in which our case can work with it as well, but 3 reasons why that is unlikely to happen. 1, it is unlikely to happen because of the circular argument that the US is running that George told you about. If the US wants to prove that socialism and generally social democracies are not a viable option, they need to have at least effects on the countries that are somewhat terrible. This basically means they need to show people starving. If that doesn't happen, by the way, notice that opening opposition never gave us a reason why affecting the 150 that changes anything, especially when that 150 is not that massively affected. Basically, either they stand for no sanctions or the sanctions we are telling you. On the second level, these sanctions that the US is likely to impose are likely sanctions that are benefiting the US itself. Not that it has happened in the status quo with Chevron. They never gave us a reason why the US would change and basically now be so democratic they only care about this. But third, even if the elites are, even if what they're saying is true, we still proven to you why even the 150 being harmed is massively detrimental for the economy of Venezuela. Lastly, on democracy in Venezuela, 4 main things. 1, they never gave us a reasoning why democracy would return in any way in Venezuela. On a second level, the whole thing about, oh, America now has the leverage because they trade with them, we tell you that, sure, that is somewhat true. However, the circular argument the US is running means that they are unlikely to turn the Venezuelan government so much. By the way, Venezuela has other options, like China, the whole competition mechanism we gave you. They don't have that much leverage. And fourth, and thirdly and finally, it is massively uncertain whether you achieve a democracy. At least under our side of the house, you have less people dying. We'll take opening. No?
The thing that you don't respond to is that all the oppression that was first proven 0-0 is legitimized once Maduro can say, "Look, I'm not that bad," since even our enemies like believe that I don't deserve the sanctions. Also, we don't just believe the sanctions are for 150. We think any sanction that you take out is over a very long period of time.
Sure. Still, our argument works with that. But anyway, what you said about legitimacy, we don't care if Maduro can legitimize it. Still more bread for Venezuelan people. That is the impact. We're not really sure what legitimacy means. Finally, on CO. CO basically tries to do three things. One, they say the problems existed before. Two things on this. One, that is largely uncomparative. We told you and gave you multiple structural reasons why the problems have increasingly heightened when you don't have access to the US market, stock markets, the dollar, etc. Basically, short problems existed before, problems now are way worse. Second of all, this is a bit of Western propaganda. Like, sure, medicines existed. I read only US news, you read only US news or Western news. We are not really sure what happens in Venezuela. The problems they say are largely exaggerated. Now, the next thing they said is, regime reduced the humanitarian harm they have. Note that this is largely uncomparative. Sure, the regime might have less, Maduro regime might have less ability to harm people. Notice how the US has no incentive to create a regime that is democratic. They want a regime that will help them. Basically, another regime that will be equally as harming human rights, like banana republics or Pinochet. At that point, it is largely uncomparative. But second of all, let's assume it's not. Sure, Maduro has less ability to harm your human rights. Your human rights is your right to bread. If you prove right to bread, we still win. For all of the above reasons, CG.
I think Gov invite opposition there.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Am I allowed to go yet?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Oh, sorry. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so first I'm going to give a quick distinction of what makes us different from OO, then I'm going to go into CG, and then I'm going to go into OG. So starting with what makes us different from OO, I think OO does a really good job at proving to us that basically Maduro is bad, and they say that we don't want him to have legitimacy, and we don't want, like his rich consorts to have, like access to their, like vacation houses in the Bahamas or wherever they choose to vacation in. So we think that we're giving you two additional things that matter more. First of all, we're telling you that it solidifies their power at the point where you let them have access to the economy again. And we're telling you that you can use lifting those sanctions, that they can use us lifting those sanctions to create an even more repressive regime, which is more important because it's not just about, like the perceived feeling of the Venezuelan population that these things are more legitimate and that the West doesn't help them, but it is actual tangible impacts where they see the West not only doesn't help them, but B, they give the regime that is suppressing them the ability to suppress them even further. Okay. Then we're telling you that sanctions are needed to get political concessions. And they kind of say that, but we're proving to you why that is working. Why is that? Because we're telling you that Maduro is ultimately dependent on his wealth and the people's wealth, in the sense of in the way that CG kind of frames it, when there's less money, that there's more reason for political reform. What does that look like? That looks like Maduro needs a police force to protect him from the people. He needs a chef to cook for him, and he needs a chauffeur to drive him around to keep him safe. At the point where he can't afford that very well anymore, you directly exert pressure onto him. That's how you get dictators to the negotiating table. That is how you get people to that is how you get dictators to actively, maybe not completely overhaul the political system and become a democratic country. I think we all agree in this debate that that is something that is pretty unlikely, but at least you get them to kind of remove some of the oppression from the people. At least you get them to maybe redistribute wealth a little fairly at the point where you directly attack them and their source of power, which in most regimes is usually the fact that they have conquered pretty much all wealth that is to be had in this country. Okay, let's go into what closing government does, because I think closing government is a little more relevant than OG in this debate. Okay, so closing government basically tells us that the US doesn't care about human rights and that it's just all due to modern McCarthyism. I think the point about modern McCarthyism is a little bit not quite accurate at this point, at the point where the US frequently now also, like we had a point before Russia invaded Putin, that before Putin invaded Ukraine, where the US was actually trying to get closer to Russia, where they were trying to establish better relationships with China. We have them actively being historically been very involved in a lot of other Central American states, not necessarily in a good way, but I think it's false to say that they don't care about other states in their vicinity at all. Victor even tells you that you don't even need good incentives to do that. The only incentive you need is that you don't want immigrants from those countries to come to you, because that would make the population, which is massively xenophobic, pretty afraid. So, okay. What else do we have? Then they tell us, like, okay, basically CG's biggest case is the thing about, like, you're gonna get 2 pieces of bread within the Venezuelan population. So first of all, the first problem I have with that is that I don't think they really actually prove how this increase in wealth actually translates into increased wealth for the population. Why is that? Because Maduro presumably controls a lot of the mechanisms the state has to garnish wealth, right? So presumably he probably controls what the banks does. He probably controls the state companies that get oil and gas into gas. He probably controls all the ministries that manage how this wealth is going to be distributed, meaning it is entirely dependent on him and what he wants, whether the money actually lands in people's hands at the end of the day, at the point where you remove all sanctions, meaning that all private companies, for example, mining oil, and the state companies are kind of like in competition with each other, where the state company that is run by Maduro will probably be stronger because that one can pull most resources, meaning that the people in Venezuela are very likely going to continue to suffer. Okay, so but what now additionally becomes worse, at the point where you increase Maduro's financial wealth, that also means you automatically give him more chances to suppress his people even further. That means all the things that we're doing right now, like, for example, meaning that Venezuela can't get credit or can't get any loans from other countries, that they can't buy weapons, that they can't, that they don't have access to, for example, I don't know what that's called, like private militaries that you pay for what they do. All of those things that Venezuela right now doesn't have access to. So we think those sanctions are very much in place to protect the Venezuelan population from Maduro himself, meaning that the point where, CG wants to tally up dead babies against each other, I don't necessarily think this is something they want to engage in, because I don't think they prove to us that they're going to have less dead babies on their side of the house. But what we can tell you is that I think that the US does have an incentive to get Maduro to the negotiation table and to get him to act more democratically, which they can only do if they have sanctions in place. First of all, is because like generally democratic regimes just tend to generate more wealth and tend to be more stable, meaning that you don't have to worry about that country that much. But secondly, it also means being on halfway decent terms with that country means you're going to shield it from influence of other nations that you necessarily don't want them to be influenced as much. But you can only do that if you have a certain sense of bargaining power with them still in place, because otherwise Venezuela is very unlikely to become democratic enough to the point that you have a population that you can negotiate with. Okay, so before I go on, I'm going to take a PY from opening.
Whoever you want to rise up in the future to replace the current regime will have limited resource because they are facing the effects of the sanctions. So any alternative to stop the regime on op dies out as well.
Okay. Okay, so first of all, I think that is true on your side of the house, right? Because at the point where you lift all sanctions, think about it, at the point where you lift all sanctions, you have now state-run firms competing with privately run firms. On our side of the house, you could lift sanctions on private firms, meaning that you basically give privately owned companies a head start, meaning that they could accrue wealth, why the Venezuelan government doesn't do that to the same extent, which is comparatively better for them. But even if that doesn't work, I'd rather have the opposition have to work with less money, because you can still directly send them money and not just give them to them by the stuff that they get by themselves. And I'd rather I'd rather give those money directly rather than having Maduro accrue more money and power in the process of them becoming like economically active. Okay, last point I really quickly want to talk about is the idea about like oil and gas reserves. I don't really see how this is that relevant for the debate, because I think that the USA has their own gas reserves and their own oil reserves. Secondly, the oil prices in the EU still rise comparatively less than in the rest of the world. And secondly, we don't really care about US SUVs running around. All things put together, we're very happy to oppose. We don't want Maduro to accrue more power. Please vote CO.
All right. I thank opposition whip simultaneously thank